Hey everyone, Eric Rennie here, and welcome to the 68th episode of the Writ Podcast. Labour tensions in Ontario have been a little high since the Ontario government under Doug Ford brought in labour legislation that banned striking for education workers, invoking the notwithstanding clause, and after only a few days, backing down, and now all the parties are back at the negotiating table. So to talk a little bit about that and also some of the leadership races we have in Ontario politics, I'm joined today by Sabrina Nanji of Queen's Park Observer and Larry Savage, Labour Studies Professor at Brock University. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks.
Great to be here.
Sabrina, I'll start with you. So, before we get into what the PCs did in terms of going back to the negotiating table, I guess the question for you would be, why did they first start with such a really kind of extreme move as just invoking the notwithstanding clause in the legislation? Why was that where they started out?
Yeah, it's kind of been a whirlwind couple of days in Ontario politics. We saw the PCs bring in this big hammer of Bill 128, which is now, soon to be dead in the water. They're going to repeal it. But it essentially invoked the notwithstanding clause in order to impose a contract on QP education workers, that school support staff like custodians, librarians, virtually everyone but teachers. And they would have made the strike illegal. There was kind of this labor board hearing just to get into the details and confirm that. But they essentially brought in this law that banned them from going on strike, that imposed this contract that the union was not willing to accept at the bargaining table. And the notwithstanding clause has been unprecedented up until pretty much Doug Ford came along in Ontario. He's used it more than any premier before him, or at least attempted to use it. There were previously, when he first came to power in 2018, he had threatened its use when it came to cutting down the size of Toronto City Hall. It turned out that he didn't end up having to use it in the end because a court sided with that decision, and so the province was A-okay in it. And then he used it last year to, I guess, muzzle, as some critics had put it, third-party groups when it came to the campaign. They were limited in what they could spend, kind of lowered the threshold for who was considered a third-party advertiser during the campaign. Mainly, unions were kind of taking the hit on that front. So then along came Bill 28. And unions sort of put their foot down, said this is not going to stand. The Ford government worked very hard during the campaign in June to win over certain union support, mainly in the private sector. That was done away with, with one stroke of the pen on Bill 28. And so I think, if you ask the premier, he says he used it because there's nothing more dangerous than education workers going on strike. I think that, there was a precedent in Ontario where Bill 115 under the McGuinty Liberal government essentially did what Bill 28 does. It imposed a contract on education workers, implemented a wage freeze. Workers and unions went to court to fight that. And years later, Ontario ended up having to be on the hook for, hundreds of millions of dollars more when the courts decided that essentially, that violated their collective bargaining rights, which is protected in the charter. And so that set the precedent for Bill 28, that essentially, the Ford government knew that per precedent, the Supreme Court has already decided that you can't do that. You can't impose a contract with legislation. You can't do that in bargaining. And so they kind of brought in the notwithstanding clause to effectively shield themselves from, potential legal challenges. My understanding is that bill could have been challenged, but now it's all kind of moot because, Ford has agreed to repeal it. QP is no longer on strike. They're going back to the bargaining table. So I guess that's a very long-winded answer, but a lot of drama happening around this use of the notwithstanding clause for sure.
And Larry, you've studied these kinds of things a lot, right? So you know all about the precedents and all this. What was your initial reaction when you saw this legislation come forward, and just how unusual is it for the government to kind of take this step from the outset?
Well, it's not unusual for a government of any political stripe to use back-to-work legislation. We've seen, every provincial government in the province virtually do that to end a labor dispute, but usually they send the outstanding issues to interest arbitration. What was different in this case was that the premier proactively invoked the notwithstanding clause And Bill 28 basically ended a strike before it could even start, which basically extinguished the rights and freedoms of those union members to bargain collectively and to go on strike. And I think that really what brought folks together from the labor movement to put their foot down was really the use of the notwithstanding clause. It was overkill. It was really an abuse of what the notwithstanding clause was intended to be used for. And I think he overplayed his hand and he really unleashed the beast, because these unions were not mobilized to fight against the government. And in fact, in the education sector in Ontario, unions famously don't really get along, and they're not very coordinated for the purposes of collective bargaining. But in one fell swoop, he brought not only all education unions together, but private and public sector unions from across the country together, including, I think, a very key moment was when the British Columbia Teachers Federation announced a $1 million donation to CUPE education workers. And then you saw the president of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union declare that their union would go out on strike as well in sympathy. And it had this real domino effect where you had the private sector unions that had endorsed Ford in the last provincial election write angry letters to the premier demanding that the bill be withdrawn. And you saw a spectacular display of solidarity on Monday when, I think it's an open secret, union leaders were about to declare that they were organizing and mobilizing for a general strike. I think that put the fear of God into the premier's office, which is why he tried to short circuit that announcement by holding his own press conference to basically announce that he would stand down if the parties would come back to the table.
Sabrina, at Queen's Park, what's been the word, at least from the government, in terms of why they have decided to more or less go back on a decision in a matter of a few days? This is kind of unprecedented in the sense of kind of blinking that fast, right? So what's been the case that the government has made as to why they made this different decision?
Well, of course, the old line is, it's all about parents, it's all about students and keeping kids in class. But I think to Larry's point, the big tipping point was, the solidarity that we saw with all unions. The threat of a general strike. I mean, we kind of heard the premier give it away a little bit in one of his press conferences this week when he said, the only thing worse than using the notwithstanding clause is a general strike, or, shutting down the economy, I should say. Sorry that I'm paraphrasing him, and you guys can see my dog getting interested back here. But he kind of gave it away when he said, that they could potentially shut down the economy, which is absolutely what a general strike would do. And so obviously, I think that had the premier, sit up a little bit and think, because I don't know if they really, knew the magnitude of what they did. And it sort of had this unintended consequence of just uniting the labor movement and really galvanizing it here in the whole country. Because, of course, Bill 28 is just an existential threat to all unions, public and private sector. If you can just legislate a contract, what is the point of a union? And so, Ford really let the genie out of the bottle there. And I think that the threat of a general strike, which of course would be pinned on Ford, public opinion data, polling data that we had seen come out suggesting that people were really paying attention to this. The notwithstanding clause, charter rights. I don't know how sexy it is, in terms of headlines, but of course everyone was paying attention to this. Everyone was kind of understanding the intricacies of, charter rights, the constitutional, questions that are being raised here. And a lot of people were blaming it on Ford, over 60%. And so we have seen Ford pivot in the face of public pressure before. I think that this one, especially because they're bargaining with teachers too, that he kind of maybe realized how they had escalated it, and decided to, maybe let cooler heads prevail. I mean, what I've been hearing is that Ford was on the phone with union leaders, LIUNA, one of the construction unions that had endorsed Ford during the campaign, and even Warren Smokey Thomas as well, the former leader of OPSU, and they kind of told Ford, the writing is on the wall here. You've let the genie out of the bottle. Now, of course, Bill 28 is not going to be repealed officially until next Monday, but it really did, set off this chain of events, and I think, Ford did not want to take the hit politically for that one.
Yeah, Larry, there was that poll that was done by Abacus Data that Sabrina was mentioning that came out. I think it was on either the Sunday or the Monday, and the schools were closed on Mondays, some of them. There was some surprising things in that poll. The sense that Ontarians did seem to blame a government rather than teachers in the past. I'm not sure it's always been as clear cut.
Absolutely. I mean, public sympathy for unions can go up and it can certainly go down. But in this case, CUPE education workers, I think, did have the support of the public. I think the most shocking number in that poll, however, was the share of Ontarians who said that they would support illegal work stoppages from other unions in sympathy with CUPE. And that's the kind of thing you see in France, not in Ontario. And so that particular finding, I think, would have surprised a lot of people, and it would have emboldened the unions to march forward in this strategy of pressuring the premier through political protest and coordinated work stoppages. And I think those polls do have an effect on government, but of course they were also backed up by what was a clear mobilization from CUPE education workers. Those picket lines at government offices were humongous. They had parents, they had other union members. It was a very strong display of solidarity that we really didn't see in the fight back against the wage restraint legislation, Bill 124, or previous incursions on labor rights under Ford. And so this was really a defining moment.
You could also suggest, Larry, that maybe this kind of action during the election might have been able to have some sort of impact.
Well, the election campaigns, I think, take on a life of their own. I think that Ford had really worked hard to bring in those building and construction trade unions, and that slow drip of endorsements from those unions, even though they make up a tiny share of the overall union membership in the province, I argued that they were worth their weight in gold, even though most unions and most large unions had endorsed the NDP. The media narrative, of course, was that Ford was gaining all of this blue-collar support because that support was so novel. We're not used to seeing union leaders stand side by side with conservative premiers, and the Tory backroom, I think, used that very effectively during the campaign.
Sabrina, what's next now? What's the process over the next few days? What's the government going to be doing? Because it sounded on the first day that Doug Ford was trying to be conciliatory, and after maybe a day, it sounded like he was getting a little frustrated. So I'm already wondering where this is going to go.
Yeah, I think we're going to see less of Doug Ford talking about this, maybe in the immediate. The mediator has kind of asked both sides not to talk too much about, what's happening behind the scenes at the bargaining table to reporters. But obviously, especially when it comes to something like education contract talks, like this is always a political hot potato. One of the battles you kind of have to win is the PR battle. And so that's why I think that poll, soon after we saw Ford coming up and basically blaming CUPE. Like, I want us both to, be cool and come back to the bargaining table, but this was all their fault. Don't blame me. And so I think that, we have seen Ford sweeten the deal a little bit. The union kind of poked holes in that. So I would say negotiations are still rocky. The other teachers are right behind. CUPE education workers is interesting because they're the first of the education union just in terms of the bargaining process. So, teachers will be coming up. I think one question everyone is asking is, will they just make education workers essential, an essential service? And that would, be a risk, I think, because obviously, we wouldn't have anything like strikes in the future, but you kind of give up a lot of your control in negotiations to an arbitrator. And so I don't know if the Ford government will necessarily go down that route. But I think that they'll be playing it laying low, I should say, playing it quiet kind of during these negotiations, because obviously, most public sector workers have been held to this 1% wage increase over the last 3 years, thanks to Bill 124. We all know, inflation is through the roof right now. And so I think that that is also probably the part of, why unions have done a better job in winning over public sentiment, because everyone can kind of understand, the struggle to make ends meet these days. But so I think, it's going to be quiet going ahead in terms of education talks, but it's not over yet. Funnily enough, CUPE is actually still in a legal strike position as it stands now. They have to give 5 days notice of any action. I don't know if they'll go that far. I think that, they'll probably be a bit quieter now and try to hammer out a deal at the bargaining table. But we could see something like arbitration go forward. But right now, I think they're going to try and hammer something out.
Yeah, we are talking, I should say, on Thursday morning, so it's always potential that by the time you're listening to this, something has happened. But Larry, Sabrina mentioned it. There's other negotiations coming up, right? So what does what happened over the last week and a half mean for those negotiations?
Well, I think it has a significant impact because, as Sabrina said, the genie's out of the bottle, which is why you saw the Premier already trying to lower expectations for other groups of public sector workers. His press conference on, I think it was on Tuesday, where he said he was going to come with a more generous offer to CUPE, that press conference was mostly directed at teachers' unions, nurses' unions, and other groups of public sector unions, because what he was saying is, I'm going to give them a better deal, but I don't want this to set a wage pattern for the broader public sector. But here's the problem that he's caused for himself. He has allowed workers and their unions to have raised expectations that they're going to be able to stand up, fight back, and win, because that's precisely what politically CUPE education workers were able to do. They also, these unions, saw this massive rallying of solidarity. I don't think 2 weeks ago any of these unions thought that they were going to make big gains at the bargaining table, but I think they now have renewed confidence to bargain hard in the face of Bill 124, understanding that their members' wages, salaries, and benefits have been eroded by inflation. And so they have a very strong claim to a catch-up round of collective bargaining. And Bill 28 didn't help any of that, because Ford basically declared war on the labor movement, and they're not going to forgive him anytime soon.
Well, Larry, you mentioned it a bit earlier, how the endorsements during the election campaign might have been had more media value, more broader value than actual vote value. But does this mean that the outreach to those voters, working class voters, that the PCs might have cost a lot of support there? Because we are talking about different people, right? People who work in the education sector might not be the same who work in a construction union, pretty obviously. But just the idea of forcing legislation that would ban striking, does that have an impact on the PC support among the Labour vote? Because we're already seeing Justin Trudeau and the Liberals seemingly very happy to try to wedge himself in there and be on the side of Labour. So clearly, some of the other parties at least are seeing an opportunity.
That's right. I mean, there's a difference between public sector unions, private sector unions. There are blue-collar workers in public sector unions. There are blue-collar workers in private sector unions. And so it can all get a little complicated. But I do think that Bill 28 did harm the Premier's reputation and relationship with blue-collar workers in both the public and private sector. Do I think that he's irreparably harmed his relationship with construction unions? No, I don't think he has. Even though the presidents of those construction unions condemned him over Bill 28, he did, after all, withdraw the legislation. And more importantly, these construction unions don't view politics through a partisan lens or even through a class-based lens. They view politics through a transactional lens. So as long as the party in government is not trying to destroy them or is not an existential threat to their existence, which basically Bill 28 was, then you're going to see construction unions continue to work to get some carrots from the provincial government. And as long as Doug Ford is continuing to offer some carrots, I think you'll continue to see that relationship. For the vast majority of the labor movement, though, I think Doug Ford crossed the line, and you're going to see a massive mobilization in the next provincial election, even though that's quite a few years away now.
Yeah, just a little bit. Speaking of the next provincial election, we'll change gears just a little bit. There's going to be new leaders at the heads of the Liberals and the New Democrats. And the NDP, of course, this debate is a very important one in terms of their future, because they did lose some seats in areas that do have that aren't downtown Toronto. It's places where they have lots of working class voters that seemingly voted for the PCs. But before we get to the NDP, Sabrina, can you give us an update on what's happening with the Liberal race? We don't have any official candidates in the running just yet.
Yeah, don't hold your breath for that anytime soon. The party's going to have its convention in next spring. I think that's when we'll start to see like the leadership contest itself start to take shape, like important dates, the rules of entry, how much money you have to raise, how many members or signatures you need to get, all of those details. And so I think that, there has been some buzz, but no one official. I know, from the federal party, Nate Erskine-Smith is one name. I think he said he's like actively discovering it. Exploring it, I should say, the last time around. I might have mentioned this to you guys before, but someone told me that the only people that are going to help him, run for provincial leader are the federal Liberals that want to see him go, because he's kind of been a thorn on the side of the federal Liberal Party. And also Ted Sue, former MP, now MPP for Kingston and the Islands, one of the couple of seats that the Liberals managed to pick up this time around in 2022. He's another rumored candidate. But, for now, they seem to be laying low. John Fraser is again taking the lead for the interim. Second time he did that after Kathleen Wynne had stepped down. But I think, this is another existential moment, for the Liberal Party, because, twice in a row getting, 7 to 8 seats, losing a couple others, especially seats that they thought they would win, including in Toronto. I think that's a big, it's a big soul searching moment for this party. And you kind of wonder if there's like a shift in Ontario politics where the Liberal brand itself is, not as strong anymore, because, of course, 2018 was a change election. It happens again in 2022. It starts to make you think, is this more than just a fluke? What's the deal? Why aren't people happy with the Liberals? So don't hold your breath for those guys just yet. And, good luck to the person who wants to lead that party and kind of bring it out of the rut that it's currently in.
Well, we could hold our breath a bit for the NDP, because that's a lot closer. They'll have a new leader in March, because that leader is going to be the leader of the official opposition, so it's a bit more of a role that should be filled. But so far, there is just one candidate in the running right now, Sabrina.
Yeah, Marit Stiles from Davenport. She's a front runner not only because she's essentially the only official candidate. She's already garnered a lot of caucus support. More than a few MPPs have endorsed her. She had a couple standing behind her when she announced. She's been a strong communicator. Up until very recently was the education critic. The party kind of decided that official leadership candidates won't take on critic roles, so that's why she was asked to step aside from that position. But I think she's definitely a strong contender, and the clock is ticking. She's obviously had all this time she's been touring, shaking hands, signing members up, that type of thing, building her campaign. And December 5th is the deadline to register. So, just under a month. I actually don't know who we'll see, because a lot of rumored people have either stepped down or still say they're thinking about it. Joel Hardin, for instance, in Ottawa, he says he's no longer going to run. Catherine Fife in Waterloo. I'm still waiting on Wayne Gates, Sol Mamakwa, and a couple others to, say either way. But right now, Marit is a strong contender, and she might be the only one.
And if there's only one person running for an NDP leadership, that goes just fine. Just ask the BC New Democrats. Larry, Labour will have a vote in the Ontario NDP, which is, how the federal NDP used to do that. They used to give a portion of the membership vote, or the portion of the vote, to Labour unions. That is still going to be the case for the Ontario NDP. So what role do you think Labour is going to play in the Ontario leadership race? And as well, if it is just Stiles that is the candidate, what will Labour think of that?
Well, I think there is some Labour support for Marit Stiles, and usually the Labour vote within those NDP conventions is not all that different from the rank and file, one member, one vote. And so it hasn't really historically been a decisive factor in delivering the leadership to one candidate or another. Stiles has a long history in the party. Of course, she was president of the federal NDP. And she also worked for ACTRA, which is the Actors Union in Toronto. So she does have a labor movement connection, which I think will serve her well. What's unfortunate for the party, though, is I think the leadership contest has been a bit of a snooze fest, where, you know, they could likely use the press of a leadership campaign to give the party more visibility, which is why I found it fascinating. Over the course of the last week on Twitter, all I see is people talking about how Laura Walton, who's the president of the Ontario School Board Council of Unions, the person at the center of the Bill 28 struggle, should in fact run for the NDP leadership. And I can't believe how much of a buzz I've seen about that particular candidate, who is a rising star in the Canadian labor movement. Of course, I called her a candidate. She's not officially a candidate. In fact, I don't expect her to announce that she's running. But I would say that some energy and enthusiasm in the race from a candidate that people could rally behind might give something more to the party out of this contest.
Yeah, we'll see if either of these are going to get a little interesting. Ontario politics has not provided often a lot of, you know, national headline news, unfortunately. So a little spice could be interesting for both of these races. So we'll see if that happens. And if it does, maybe we'll chat again. So Larry and Sabrina, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.